She had been dead for 11 minutes before she decided to come back. Not clinically dead. Her heart had kept a dull, irregular rhythm, enough to keep the machines from screaming. But the part of her that was Dr. Yale Morrow, the part that formed opinions about coffee and remembered the exact pitch of her mother's laugh, had gone somewhere else. Later, when they asked her to describe it, she said it was like standing at the edge of a very large room in which all the lights had just gone out. Not dark, not quiet, just a space that had been emptied of everything that made it useful. She had been in that space for 11 minutes. When she came back, the first thing she saw was the ceiling of the xenobiology lab on Station Ket 7, water stained from the coolant leak no one had fixed. And the second thing she felt was the cold certainty that whatever was on the other side of the Veth threshold was not nothing. It was waiting. The Vethari had arrived at the edge of the solar system 4 years earlier, which in the history of first contacts was almost laughably abrupt. No signals preceding them, no radio noise from their passage through the outer dark. One day the Kuiper probes were sending back routine telemetry, and the next they were sending back silence, and the day after that the silence had a shape. A cluster of 17 vessels, each one roughly the diameter of Phobos, arranged in a formation that xenogeometrists later called the dispersed bloom, which sounded peaceful until you understood that a bloom in Vethari physics meant the precursor spread of a detonation front. They had not detonated anything. They had simply waited, their ships shedding heat at a rate that suggested enormous internal processes, and sent down exactly one transmission in a language that took 4 months to partially decode. The core of the message, once they could read it, was not a greeting. It was an accounting. It listed human resource consumption over the past 2 centuries. Energy draws, atmospheric alteration, biomass conversion, mineral extraction, every ecological footprint humanity had pressed into the planet's skin, rendered in Vethari numerics with the clinical precision of an audit. At the bottom of the accounting was a single symbol that the translators had argued over for weeks before reaching a reluctant consensus. The symbol meant insufficient, as in you have consumed more than your allocation, as in the system you inhabit is no longer in balance, as in correction is required. The Vethari did not explain what correction meant. They didn't have to. 2 weeks after the transmission, they nudged one of their vessels into a lower orbit, not threatening, not overtly hostile, just repositioned, the way you might move a hand closer to a door handle. And the 16 remaining ships in the dispersed bloom shifted orientation by 3 degrees in concert, like flowers turning toward a sun that hadn't risen yet. Earth's government spent 8 months trying diplomacy. They sent transmissions in 17 languages, offered resource accounting of their own, proposed frameworks for sustainable development review, forwarded detailed analyses of human cultural evolution toward environmental stewardship. They received no response. The Vethari listened to everything. They could tell, because sometimes the nearest ship would pulse once with what the physicist identified as a focused acknowledgement beam, a faint technical nod, and said nothing. After 8 months, one of the vessels in low orbit released something. It was small, roughly the size of a shipping container, and it fell through the atmosphere without burning. Not because it had shielding, but because the atmosphere seemed to part around it, just slightly, in a way that the fluid dynamics teams found deeply unsettling. It landed in the Mojave without a crater, which was almost more frightening than if it had made one. Inside was a device. They took 16 months to partially understand it. It was, as near as they could determine, a kind of quantum thermodynamic processor, a machine that could accelerate entropy in a localized volume of space, a device that could unmake things, not destroy them in any conventional sense, not burn or shatter or vaporize, but rather bring them to their lowest possible energy state in a very short amount of time. Everything decays given enough time. The Vethari had built something that could give things all the time they needed at once. The device in the Mojave could cover, according to the physicists' best estimates, an area of approximately 300,000 square kilometers. It had not activated. It was sitting there, inert, a demonstration piece, a sample of what the Vethari considered a proportionate corrective response for a species that had overspent its energy budget. Yale was 29 years old when the Mojave device landed, and 34 when she flatlined on the table in Lab 7 of Station Ket 7 and saw the inside of the empty room. In between those events, she had done her doctoral work in xenobiological thermodynamics, developed a framework for modeling entropy gradients in non-terrestrial biological systems. published 4 papers that the small community of people who understood them considered important, and turned down 2 job offers from the Vethari Response Consortium because she thought they were asking the wrong questions. The consortium wanted to know how to counter the entropy device. Yael wanted to know what the Vethari were actually afraid of, because something was making them afraid. She was certain of this the way she was certain of very few things. Not from evidence exactly, but from the structure of the evidence's absence. 17 ships at the edge of the solar system. 4 years of silence, a demonstration weapon deployed without explanation. This was not the behavior of an empire that felt secure. This was the behavior of something that had learned to be careful. She was working on proving it when she died. The experiment that killed her, temporarily, was an attempt to measure what she called bleed-through resonance, a theoretical phenomenon she had derived from the Vethari thermodynamic models. The models were internally inconsistent in one specific way that everyone else had written off as a translation artifact. Yale thought the inconsistency was real, and that it implied the Vethari's entropy technology had a flaw. It worked perfectly in isolated systems, but in a system with a sufficiently complex information topology, a living brain, for example, it would produce a feedback resonance that reflected back against the operator. She had wanted to map what that resonance looked like. To see it, you needed to be on both sides of the threshold simultaneously. You needed to briefly stop being a closed system. She had briefed her colleague Tomas on the theory, left him detailed written instructions, and then let him inject her with a precisely calibrated compound that stopped her heart for a target duration of 9 minutes. The overdose was not intentional. The overdose was Tomas's handshaking because he loved her and was terrified, and she had not fully accounted for that. She was dead for 11 minutes instead of 9. In those 11 minutes, she was standing in the empty room. And in the empty room, she became aware of something pressing against the walls. Not from outside, from within the structure of the space itself, as if the darkness had a texture that, if you understood how to read it, resolved into information, into signal. She came back understanding 3 things. First, the empty room was not empty. It was structured. It had a geometry that implied intention. Second, the Vethari had been here, not metaphorically. Their technology, their entropy processing, left marks in the fabric of what lay beyond the threshold, the way fingers leave oil on glass. She could read their presence the way you read old graffiti. The marks of passage, of repeated passage, of familiarity. They'd been coming here for a long time. Third, they were scared of what they found. She lay on the ceiling-stained table in Lab 7 for 4 minutes after Tomas got her heart going again, not speaking, cataloging what she remembered. Then she sat up and said, "Get me a meeting with the consortium, and bring me the inconsistency dataset." I was right about the inconsistency. Tomas, whose face had the look of someone who had just watched a person he loved return from a place he couldn't follow, said, "Yael, I know," she said. "I know. I'll drink something warm. Get me the meeting." The meeting with the consortium took 3 weeks to arrange and 40 minutes to fall apart. She told them about the bleed-through resonance. She told them about the structure she'd found in the threshold space. She showed them the inconsistency in the Vethari models, walked them through her derivation, explained why it implied the entropy device had a reflective failure mode in high-complexity information systems. She showed them the EEG data from the 11 minutes, which had produced readings that the resident neuroscientist described as not consistent with any known state of consciousness, including sleep, coma, or clinical death, and which Yale described as a map. The consortium's response, delivered by its director, a deliberate woman named Cho Renwei, who had spent 20 years in planetary defense and had the face of someone who had learned to make hard decisions without visibly making them, was measured and final. They appreciated the data. The neural readings were unusual, and they would be forwarded to the neuroscience team. The resonance theory was interesting and would be added to the modeling backlog. The inconsistency in the Vethari dataset had been noted previously and was considered a translation artifact. They did not intend to pursue a line of research that required human subjects to be clinically deceased, as the Ethical Review Board had already declined 3 similar proposals, and the director did not anticipate that changing. Yale listened to all of this. Then she said, "They've been there, the Vethari. They've been going across the threshold for a long time, and they know what's there, and that's why they're scared. And if you understand what they found there, you understand why their entropy technology works the way it does, and why it has the failure mode it has, and why that failure mode is the only lever we have. Cho Renwei looked at her for a long moment. Dr. Morrow, we have 12 months before the Vethari's operational pause ends. In those 12 months, I have 43 research teams working on 43 approaches to this problem. I don't have room for a 44th approach that begins with a researcher having died. Yael had expected this. She had prepared for this. She said, "Then I'll work outside the consortium." She did. Station Ket-7 was officially a xenobiology research platform in mid-Earth orbit, staffed by 21 researchers, 3 of whom were now working on something the station manifest described as an extended thermodynamic modeling project. The other 2 were Tomas, who had agreed after several days of silence and one very long argument about whether Yael had the right to keep risking her own life, and had agreed not because he was convinced, but because he understood that she would do it regardless. And a physicist named Dara Osei, who had read Yael's paper on the inconsistency, identified herself as having independently reached an adjacent conclusion, and arrived at Ket-7 6 weeks after the consortium meeting with a bag of specialized measurement equipment, and the look of someone who had been waiting for this conversation. Dara's contribution was the instrument. She had been developing it for 2 years, not for this purpose, but for measuring quantum coherence decay in biological systems. And she recognized immediately that with a small modification, it could map information topology in the threshold space. Could, in other words, see what Yael had seen. Without requiring Yael to stop her heart again. Without requiring anyone to stop their heart, Tomas had said very firmly. Without requiring anyone to stop their heart, Dara had agreed, which was true. The modified instrument could map the threshold space from the margin. You didn't need to cross over. You needed to be close enough to the edge. They spent 4 months developing what they called the proximity protocol, a method for inducing controlled near-death approach states that brought the subject to the margin without crossing it. Using a combination of the compound Tomas had originally developed, targeted hypothermia, and a neural suppression technique that Dara had adapted from Vethari medical data that the consortium had declassified 3 years ago and apparently not thoroughly read. The Vethari used a similar technique, the data suggested, for reasons the consortium's xenobiologists had classified as ceremonial. Yael did not think the reasons were ceremonial. In the 4th month, running the protocol on herself with Tomas and Dara monitoring, she reached the margin and held it for 6 minutes, long enough to work. The threshold space was structured as she had understood from her 11 minutes. It had a topology. And embedded in that topology, like scratches in old paint, were the marks of Vethari passage. But also something else, something she had not been close enough or long enough to read the first time. The something else was not Vethari. It was older. It was the thing the Vethari had found when they first came here. And she could read it now, the way you read a text in a language you've studied but never spoken, haltingly, with long pauses. She came back and spent 14 hours writing. What she had read was this. The threshold space was not a void. It was a record. The second law of thermodynamics described entropy as increase, systems tending toward their lowest energy state, order dissolving into disorder, energy dispersing until it was useless. But the threshold space was where that energy went, not dispersed, not lost, organized, in a way that required no physical substrate to maintain, because the threshold space had its own rules, its own laws, that were not the second law. What accumulated there was not chaos. It was the accumulated complexity of every system that had ever decayed, every structure, every pattern, every arrangement of matter that had ever achieved sufficient information density before the second law took it apart. The Vethari had found this. The Vethari had understood correctly that their entropy technology was drawing from this space, using it as a substrate, accelerating local decay by borrowing structure from the accumulated record beyond the threshold. And they had found, when they looked closely, that the record had a preference, not a mind, not a will, but a gradient, the same way a hillside has a preference for the direction water flows. The record had an orientation, and that orientation, as near as the Vethari could determine, ran against entropy. The accumulated complexity of everything that had ever decayed was oriented toward reconstitution, toward rebuilding, toward the opposite of what the second law predicted. This was what they were afraid of, not humanity, not Earth, not the imbalance in the resource accounting. They were afraid that if humanity was allowed to develop along its current trajectory, chaotic, contradictory, relentlessly complex, generating information density at a rate the Vethi models identified as geometrically accelerating, humanity would at some point reach a sufficient threshold of accumulated complexity to tip the gradient, to begin drawing from the other side rather than being drawn toward it, to reverse the process, to violate the second law not locally and temporarily, as all life did, but permanently, systemically, structurally. They wanted to reduce humanity to a manageable level of complexity before that happened, not out of malice, out of the same institutional caution that had kept their own civilization stable for 300,000 years, out of fear of what a species that could reverse entropy might do. Yale wrote all of this down. Then she wrote down the rest of it, the failure mode. Their entropy device worked by creating a localized depletion of the threshold space, drawing down the accumulated record in a targeted area, using it to fuel the local acceleration of decay. But the record was oriented against entropy. It pushed back. In a system with sufficient information complexity, a living neural network, a sufficiently dense social information structure, a city, the pushback was not absorbed by the device. It was reflected. The Vethari's own models showed this in the inconsistency. They had corrected for it in their calculations by assuming no target system would achieve the necessary information density. They had made this assumption because no system they had ever encountered had achieved it. Humanity had. Not in any individual brain. The pushback from a single mind was negligible, but in a networked system of sufficient scale, a city, a station, a connected group of minds working in concert. The reflected resonance from a threshold space depletion event would not dissipate. It would amplify. It would feed back into the device's own operational substrate. It would, in Dara's careful formulation when Yale walked her through it, cause the device to eat itself. They needed to prove it. They had 8 months left before the Vethari's operational pause ended. They had a sensor array, a detailed map of the threshold space topology, and a theoretical framework that none of the 43 consortium teams had, because none of them had been willing to die for 11 minutes to find it. They did not have the consortium's resources, their facilities, their computational infrastructure, or their authority to broadcast a proof to the Vethari. Tomas, reading through Yale's 14 hours of writing, had gone quiet in the way he went quiet when he was rearranging his understanding of something important. He did this for a long time. Then he said, if we're right about the amplification, and we can demonstrate it, actually trigger it on a small scale, something observable, they'll see it from orbit. Yale looked at him. The Vethari, he said. They're watching everything, every experiment on every station. They have been since they arrived. If we produce the resonance signature, they'll see it, and they'll know we know. That's the point, Yale said. That's the terrifying part, Tomas said. Yes, she said. That too. The demonstration experiment took 11 weeks to design and 3 weeks to build. Dara rewired the coherence decay instrument into something that could produce rather than just measure the threshold interaction. Could, in controlled conditions, create a microscale depletion event and measure the reflected resonance from the information density of the 3 minds monitoring it. The system they needed to protect was themselves, 3 people, networked through the monitoring equipment, constituting a sufficiently complex local information system that the reflected resonance would be measurable. On paper, it was elegant. In practice, it required Yael to hold the proximity protocol state for 12 minutes while Dara ran the depletion sequence and Tomas managed the instrumentation. And at minute 8, Yael's blood pressure dropped to a point where Tomas took his hands off the instruments and put them on the crash cart, which was when Dara said very quietly, "It's working." Yael heard this from the margin. She was at the edge of the empty room, the threshold space open around her, and she could feel the depletion. A small withdrawal from the accumulated record, a thinning of the complex texture she had learned to read, like a hand reaching through gauze. And she could feel the pushback, the orientation of the record, running against the depletion, finding the path of least resistance back toward complexity, finding her, finding all 3 of them, the dense web of signal that 3 interconnected human minds produced, and reflecting off it like light off a mirror, and flowing back. She came back when Tomas pulled her back, 12 minutes and 40 seconds in, 20 seconds past the target, and 40 seconds past the safe margin. She sat up on the table and her ears were ringing, and she said, "Did we get the data?" "We got the data," Dara said. She was looking at the readout with an expression that Yael recognized, the look of a person seeing confirmation of something they had theorized but not believed they would actually see. "The resonance signature is," she paused. "It's very clean, very clear." "Clean enough for them to read from orbit?" Dara looked at her instruments. Then she looked up. They already read it. "I'm seeing an acknowledgement beam from the nearest vessel. They've been watching since Minute 3. In the silence that followed, all three of them looked at the ceiling, which was still water-stained from the coolant leak, as if the Vethari ship were visible through the station hull. "So they know we know," Tomas said. "They know we know," Yael said, "and they know we can do it again. And they know we know that they know." "What do they do now?" Dara asked. This was the question Yale had been building toward for 5 years, through 2 grant cycles and 1 death and 300 pages of notes, and a theory that everyone with resources had told her was not worth funding. The answer was in the threshold space, in the accumulated record, in the orientation of everything that had ever been ordered, and then decayed. The answer was in the Vethari's fear, which was a real fear, a justified fear, a fear with correct mathematics behind it. She said, "They recalculate." She was right. It took them 4 days. On the 4th day after the experiment, a transmission arrived at Station Ket 7 specifically, not broadcast to Earth, not sent to the consortium, but directed at the station's receiver with the precision of a message intended for a specific recipient. It was in Vethari encoding. Dara decoded it in 6 hours. It said in the translation they had learned to trust, "We have reviewed the resonance event. We have revised the accounting. We request continued observation of the threshold engagement research. The correction protocol is suspended pending the outcome of this observation." Not canceled, suspended. The Vethari were not, as a rule, hasty, but suspended was enough. Suspended meant the Mojave device sat inert for another season. Suspended meant the dispersed bloom held its orientation, neither advancing nor retreating, the way a conversation holds when both parties have said something that needs to be considered. Cho Ren-wei arrived at Ket 7 6 days after the transmission, which was the fastest Yale had ever seen the director travel. She read the full 14 hours of notes, the experiment documentation, the decoded transmission, and the resonance data. She did this in 8 hours, which was also the fastest Yale had ever seen Cho Ren-wei do anything. Then she looked at Yael across the workbench in Lab 7 and said, "You should have come back to us after the first crossing. You would have shut it down," Yael said. Cho Ren-wei didn't argue with this. She was silent for a moment. "Then what do they want from the continued observation?" "They want to understand how we do it," Yael said. "What the information density of a human cognitive system actually looks like from the threshold side. They've never encountered a species that achieved this density. Their models predicted we wouldn't for another several hundred years." She paused. "We surprised them. I think they find that, I want to say frightening, but I think it's more specific than that. I think they find it instructive." "Instructive how?" "Their civilization has been stable for 300,000 years. That kind of stability requires very careful management of complexity. They've spent a long time learning to limit the rate at which their own systems generate information density, because the rate was threatening to outpace their ability to maintain equilibrium." She looked at the resonance data on Dara's screen, the clean signature of the reflected threshold interaction, a curve that looked, now that she knew how to read it, almost like a heartbeat. "We didn't manage it. We generated complexity the way we do everything, chaotically, without a plan, because of 10,000 competing pressures and interests, and because we are very bad at doing things the sensible way when the sensible way would require everyone to agree." "You're saying our dysfunction is our advantage." "I'm saying our dysfunction produced a level of information complexity that their 300,000-year-old civilization never achieved. And I'm saying that when you have the technology they have, when you can reach into the threshold space and draw from the accumulated record of everything that ever existed, a species that can generate that kind of complexity is not a resource management problem." She met the director's eyes. "It's a collaborator." Cho Ren-wei was quiet for a long time. Outside the lab's single porthole, Earth rotated with the patience of something that had never been in a hurry. Somewhere above them, 17 ships held their positions in the dispersed bloom, their acknowledgement beams pulsing occasionally, reading. "They'll want more experiments," the director said finally. "Yes." They'll want access to the threshold engagement research, to the resonance data. Yes. In exchange, Yale thought about the threshold space, the accumulated record, the orientation of complexity against entropy, the pressure of everything that had ever been ordered pushing back against the direction of decay. She thought about her dead parents, who she had never met. Her mother taken when she was 3. Her father 2 years later, both of them gone, in the way that people went, the irrecoverable way. And about the room she had stood in for 11 minutes. And whether the marks she had read there, the familiar human marks among the Vethari traces and the older record, might have included something she recognized. She had not let herself think about this too directly. It was not useful to think about. But it was true that the first time she stood in the threshold space, in those 11 undirected minutes, the thing she had felt pressing through the walls of the empty room had not felt like nothing. It had felt like a kind of attention. She said, in exchange, they teach us what they know about the threshold space, which is several 100,000 years worth of research that we don't have. She paused, and they stopped treating the accounting as a death warrant. And if they won't, then we keep doing the experiments, Yale said simply. Every time we trigger a resonance event, we demonstrate what we can do. Every demonstration makes the accounting more complicated. Eventually, the accounting becomes a different kind of document. An argument for preservation, for investment, Yale said. There's a difference. The consortium formally opened contact with the Vethari observation team 43 days later. The first structured exchange was not a negotiation in the political sense. It was closer to a seminar. The Vethri sent 3 representatives whose biology was roughly analogous to what the xenobiologist would have predicted from the ship data. Large, slow-moving, temperature-sensitive, operating on a sensory bandwidth that overlapped with human perception in some frequencies and was entirely alien in others. They communicated through a translation medium that had taken both sides 6 weeks to construct. And the first thing they communicated, once the medium was working, was a question. They wanted to know how it had started, the research. Not the theory, not the methodology, the reason. Why this specific scientist? Why this specific line of inquiry? Why this approach that required standing at the edge of what lay beyond? Yale answered through the translation medium. She said she had needed to understand what was on the other side. Not abstractly, specifically. She had lost people there, the way people did, and she had needed to know whether there was a structure to it, whether it was meaningful in any sense that the second law permitted. The Vethari's response took a long time to come back through the translation medium. Long enough that Dara leaned over and whispered that she thought the connection might have dropped. But it hadn't dropped. The Vethari were simply processing something that, apparently, required more time than a standard query. When the response came, it was not in the technical register they had been using. It was in a register the translation medium had no clean parallel for, a register that fell. The translators later decided, somewhere between the formal address used for significant disclosures and the informal address used for things that were too important to dress up. The response said, "We also have lost people there. We also needed to know. Then, we thought the answer was the same as the second law. We thought we had proven it was the same as the second law. Then, we were wrong about you. We may have been wrong about that also." Yael read this 3 times. Then she handed the translation to Tomas, who read it and said nothing for a while. "Is this a negotiation tactic?" he asked. "I don't think so," she said. "It's a strange thing for a species that just had a weapon pointed at us to say." "Yes," Yale said. "It is." She looked at the data still running on Dara's screens, the resonance signature, the clean heartbeat curve of reflected complexity, the orientation of everything that had ever existed, running stubbornly against the direction of decay. That's what makes it interesting. Outside, the dispersed bloom was still there. 16 ships and the one in low orbit, still watching, still processing, still running the accounting in which humanity's existence appeared as a line item that had, as of 43 days ago, changed categories. Not managed, not corrected, observed. Yale understood something about being observed. You stood at the margin. You held yourself at the edge of the empty room, and you let the structured darkness wash over you, and you read what it had to say, and you brought it back, because that was the work. That was the specific, irreplaceable human thing, to need to know what was on the other side badly enough to go look, and to come back with something useful, and to do it again. The accounting would be revised. The Vethari would take a long time about it. 300,000 years of careful calibration did not change in a season, but they would revise it. They had found something their models had not included, and they were, if nothing else, thorough. She was going back in. Tomorrow or the next day, the threshold space had more to give. The accumulated record had more to say, and she was still learning to read it. And there were 300,000 years of Vethari research to integrate. And there was the question she had not let herself ask directly, the question of the specific marks in the record, the familiar ones. That question could wait. She had learned that questions that needed answering would keep. She went to the porthole. Earth turned below. The same careful revolution, cloud systems sprawling over blue ocean, the messy, unmanaged surface of a world that had never learned to limit its own complexity. It looked from here exactly like what it was. A blip of chaos in a very large and very quiet space. A system running against the law. Generating structure faster than the law could take it apart. Getting away with it, for now. She pressed one hand to the porthole glass. Cold through the hull, and beneath the cold, the faint hum of the station's systems. And beneath that, if you knew how to feel for it, the barely there pressure of the threshold space running close to every surface, every structure, every complex arrangement of atoms that was currently engaged in the long argument against entropy. She could feel it now since the 11 minutes. She had been feeling it ever since. Not hearing, not seeing, feeling. The push of it, the accumulated record of everything, pushing back. She thought. We are not done yet, she thought. We are, in fact, barely started. She went back to work.